On a pine floor in the Carolina Piedmont, a woman of 71 sat holding a sealed envelope her husband had hidden for 40 years, her own name written on the front, in the careful hand of a much younger man. She did not know yet that the quietest winter of her marriage had been the most dangerous, or that the man who should have stood between her and harm had once stepped out of the way to save himself. Long before her, another faithful wife stood in that same danger, handed off by a frightened husband in 3 words Scripture refuses to soften: "She is my sister." The same quiet betrayal, 4,000 years apart. But here is what neither wife knew, and what this brittle letter was about to tell her. Someone had been keeping watch over the very thing her husband worked so hard to hide. The only question left was who. Her name was Lorraine Mabry, and an hour before, she had only meant to find the folder with the insurance papers. The doctor had used a word that week she did not like, and a woman of her years learns to keep such papers where she can lay a hand on them. The roll-top desk in the back bedroom had come down from her husband Earl's daddy, and his daddy before that, hauled out of the Piedmont clay back when the cotton mills were still hiring every hand that could reach a spindle. She had not been looking for a secret, but her fingers, feeling along the back of a bottom drawer that fought her the way old things fight the people who have outlived their use for them, found the envelope instead, brittle and gone brown at the edges the way paper goes when it has waited a long time in the dark. The date in the corner reading 1968. And her name on the front, written not in the shaking hand of the old man asleep down the hall now, but in the careful, pressing hand of a young man who once bore down hard enough to dent the page. She sat back on her heels and did not open it, because a woman does not live beside a man for 49 years without learning the weather of his face, and there had always been one shut room in Earl Mabry she had never once been let into. She had felt the door of it her whole married life, a draft under it, a quiet that came over him at certain words, at the mention of the old mill village, at the name of a man he would not say. She had learned, the way wives learn, to walk past that door and not knock. And friend, it may be a question you have held too. What does a good man hide for 40 years? And what does the silence cost the very person he was trying to protect by keeping it? She did not know yet that the letter was not only a confession. She did not know that it was, before it was anything else, a record. A record of a hand she had never seen, moving over her life across all the years she believed she had been walking it alone. The seal gave way under her thumb, like something that had been waiting to. His hand filled the first page edge to edge, the way men of that generation wrote when paper cost money. "Lorraine," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am either gone or finally brave, and we both know which is more likely. There is a thing I did when we were young that I have never told you, and I have decided you should not go into the ground not knowing how close you once came, nor who it was that stood between you and the worst of it. It was not me. Lord knows it was not me." She read that line 3 times. It was not me. And then the young man down on the page began to tell her about a year she could barely remember, a year when they had nothing. They had married in the spring and come down to the mill village on the Catawba River with 1 trunk and a cast-iron skillet and a faith that was mostly hers. The mill owned the houses then, narrow clapboard houses set in rows, and the mill owned the work, and through the work and the houses, the mill owned the people, though no one said it that plain. The man who owned the mill, Earl would not write his name even now, 50 years on. He wrote only the man, was a tall, smiling man who walked the rows on Sunday afternoons in a clean white shirt, and who had a way of stopping at certain porches and not others. He had stopped at theirs. Earl was 19 and new, and terrified of the cold months coming, and when the man's eyes went to Lorraine on the steps, 20 years old and lovely, in a way that poverty had not yet worn down, something in Earl went small and afraid. The man asked, easy as weather, was that his sister keeping house for him? And Earl, God forgive him, he wrote, and the ink was darker there, where his hand had stopped and started. Earl said yes. He said she was his sister. He let the man believe there was no claim on her but kin, no husband to answer to, because a husband can be sent away on a long job up the line, and a brother cannot. And Earl had seen what happened to families who lost favor with the man who owned the houses. He had a wife and no money, and the winter coming, and he traded the truth for the rent. Now stay with me here, friend, because this is the oldest fear in the world, and it is written down in a book far older than that mill. Long before Earl Mabry sat on a porch on the Catawba and called his wife his sister to a powerful man, another frightened husband did the very same thing, in the very same words. His name was Abraham, and Scripture does not flinch from telling it. He came down into a country ruled by a king named Abimelech, and he was afraid, and so he made a plan with the wife he loved, and the Bible records it without softening a single corner. She is my sister. The same 3 words, across 4,000 years. And the strangest part, the part that makes this no simple lie, is that it was half true. When the thing came undone, Abraham would defend himself by saying it. She really was his half-sister. That is what made it so easy to say, and so deadly to mean. It was a true fact arranged to hide a truer one. He did not invent a falsehood, he selected one. He told the part of the truth that kept him safe, and buried the part that kept her his. That is what fear does to a man, even a good man. It does not always make him into a liar. Sometimes it just makes him quiet about the one thing that matters most. And when Abraham was finally cornered and asked why on earth he had done it, he gave an answer that could have come straight off that porch on the Catawba River. He said, "I thought there was no God in this place. I looked around at the power of the man over me, and I could not see the power of God above him. So I made myself small, and I put my wife where the danger was, because I judged that the danger to her was less than the danger to me." Friend, hold that beside Earl's brown page. Surely the fear of God is not in this place. That is the sentence underneath every secret a frightened man ever kept. It is not that he stopped believing in God. It is that, in the moment, he could not see God in the room, and so he protected the only thing he could see, himself. Lorraine read on, and her hands had begun to shake now, because the young man on the page was no longer confessing a feeling, he was confessing a danger. The man who owned the mill, Earl wrote, had begun to send for her. Small things at first, a basket of work to carry up to the big house, an errand that kept her late, and then less small. There came a week in the cold of that first winter, when the man arranged for Earl to be put on a crew, going up the line to the next county. 3 days, maybe 4, and there was a look the foreman gave him, handing down the order that Earl understood, and could not say out loud. He understood that he was being moved out of the way. He understood what the house on the hill intended for the woman he had called his sister. And he had no money, and no standing, and no name to set against the name that owned the road they lived on. He went up the line because a man who owns your bread can make you go. And he lay awake 3 nights in a boarding house in a strange town, sick to his stomach, having handed his own wife into the open because he had been too frightened to say the one word, wife, that might have shut the door. "This is the part you were never meant to know," he wrote, "that you were not safe, that for one winter you were as exposed as a lamb in an open field, and the man who should have stood in the gap for you had stepped out of it himself." Lorraine set the page down in her lap. She was 71 years old, and she was learning, for the first time, that the quietest year of her young marriage had been the most dangerous, and that the danger had come not only from the man on the hill, but from the silence of the man beside her. There is a particular grief that has no name, the grief of discovering that you were betrayed in a season you remember as ordinary. She had baked bread that winter. She had sung in the choir at the little Baptist church at the bottom of the village. She had thought herself a poor young wife and nothing more, and all the while she had been standing on the edge of something and never known to be afraid. She remembered the cold of that house now, the way the wind came up off the river, through the gaps in the clapboard, and they had stuffed the window frames with rags. She remembered the 3 days Earl was up the line, and how she had thought he seemed strange when he came home, gray-faced and clinging to her in the doorway like a man back from a war she had not known was being fought. She had blamed it on the long crew and the bad food and thought no more of it. She remembered, too, the week the big house on the hill went dark, the wagons coming for kin, the hushed talk at the well, and how she had said a prayer for the sick man without the first idea that the sick man had been reaching for her, or that the sickness had been the very wall of God set up between his reaching and her life. Maybe you know that grief, friend. Maybe you have found out, late, That someone you trusted was quiet about a thing that could have cost you everything. Stay with me here, because the letter is not finished, and neither is the older story, and in both of them the same thing is about to happen. The thing that is the whole reason Earl sealed this page away and could not bear to give it to her while he could still see her face. Because here is what neither frightened husband knew. In Gerar and on the Catawba River, the door that should have been shut by a man was about to be shut by use. Someone else. In the old story, it happened in the dark. The king had taken Sarah into his house, and the matter looked finished, and there was no Abraham to stop it, and no power on earth set against the king. And in the deepest part of that night, God himself walked into the king's sleep. She is a man's wife, Beulat Baal, in the Hebrew, a woman bound to a husband in covenant. The very truth Abraham would not say, God said. The husband had hidden the covenant. The Lord announced it. And then God said the thing that is the hinge of this whole video, the sentence that recontextualizes every frightened silence ever kept. And friend, you need to hear it slowly. I also withheld thee. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. There is a word standing under the English there, a Hebrew word, kasak, and it does not mean that God watched and hoped. It means to hold back, to restrain, to keep something from happening by main force. It is the word you would use for a hand laid flat against a door that another hand is pushing on. God is not telling the king, I noticed what you were about to do. God is telling him, I had my hand on the door the entire time. You never came as close as you thought, because I was holding you off her. Sarah did not pray for that. Scripture does not record one word from her in the whole account. She did not negotiate. She did not even know, by the look of it, the full measure of where she stood. The defense was not hers to arrange. The defense was God's, and it moved while she slept, on her behalf, without her permission and without her knowledge. The husband had been asleep to her danger. The God of Israel had not slept at all. And on the Catawba River, 4,000 years downstream, the same hand came down on the same kind of door. Earl wrote it plain, because by the time he wrote it, he had finally understood what he was looking at. On the third night up the line, the night he lay awake certain he had thrown his own marriage into the fire, the man who owned the mill was taken sick, not a little sick. In the space of a single week, the tall, smiling man in the clean white shirt was laid flat, and his whole household with him, a sickness the county doctor could not name, that emptied the big house on the hill and sent for kin from 2 states off. By the time Earl came back down the line, frantic, half running the last mile, the danger had simply lifted. The man never sent for Lorraine again. Within the year he had sold his interest in the mill and moved away west, a changed and frightened man, and the porch on the Catawba was quiet, and the young wife who had baked bread through it all never knew that anything had happened to her at all. For years, Earl wrote, I told myself it was luck. A man takes sick. It happens. I did not want to look straight at it, because if it was not luck, then I had to reckon with the fact that the wife I had failed had been guarded by hands that did not fail, and that I had spent that winter terrified of a man whom God could lay flat with a fever. I had bowed to a power that the Lord swatted down like a fly. I had said there was no God in that place, and there had been God in that place the whole time, standing exactly where I was too afraid to stand. Lorraine read it, and the strange thing was that she did not feel the rage she might have felt at 25. She was 71, and she had buried a daughter, and raised 2 sons, and sat up with Earl through a heart attack and a slow recovery, and she had spent 50 years learning what the letter was only now telling her in so many words, that the Lord her God had been the keeper of her life when she did not even know to ask. The mill village, the choir, the bread, all that ordinary winter had been the truest fact in the village, truer than the rent, truer than the man on the hill, and she had walked through the middle of it humming hymns and never seen the camp of God pitched around her own front steps. This is the thing the world calls coincidence, and Scripture calls the unseen hand. This is the slow, hidden work of a God who defends the faithful, not always with thunder, but very often with a quiet that looks, from the inside, like nothing happening at all. You did not get the job, and it spared you. The man moved away. The sickness came at the strangest time. The deal fell through the week before it would have ruined you. Friend, how much of your life has been kept by a hand you were too close to the ground to see? For there is one more thing the old story insists on, and Earl's letter, without ever having read it, lands in the same place. When the danger was past, God did not destroy the frightened husband. He did not expose Abraham to ruin or hold him up to the village as a coward. He called him something else entirely. He said to the king, "He is a prophet." The same man who had just traded his wife's safety for his own. God still called him a prophet, still gave him work to do, still ran the healing of that whole household back through his prayers. And the reason the wombs of that house had been closed at all, the reason the whole kingdom had been held in suspense, the Bible gives in one line, and it is the most tender line in the chapter, because it tells you exactly whose side God had taken. Because of Sarah. Heaven shut an entire kingdom's future for the sake of one woman who did not even know she was being defended. That is the worth God sets on a faithful wife. That is the lengths to which he will go for one of his own. And Sarah was not the last. Generations later there was another faithful wife named Abigail, wise and steady, and married to a fool named Nabal, whose pride and temper dragged his whole household to the very edge of ruin. She had done nothing to earn the danger his folly brought down on her, and she could not undo it by her own hand. But she did not have to. The same God who shut a kingdom for Sarah dealt with the foolish husband himself, in his own time. The faithful wife of a foolish man, defended not by the man, but by the Lord. It is the same hand reaching across the same kind of danger, the same quiet refusal to let a woman who trusted him be destroyed by the failure of the one who should have shielded her. So the secret in the drawer was never only a confession of a frightened man's failure. That is what Earl thought it was, for years, which is why he could not give it to her. He thought he was handing his wife the proof that he had failed her. But friend, look at what he was actually holding all that time. He was holding the record of a rescue. He was holding 40 years of evidence that the God of Abraham and Sarah is the same God over the mill villages of the Carolina Piedmont, that he is, in the words the king of Israel set to music, a buckler. The Hebrew is magen, a shield strapped to the arm, held up between the body and the blow. The husband had stepped out of the gap. God had stepped into it, and he had stayed there, unthanked and unseen, for half a century, while the woman he shielded baked her bread and raised her boys, and grew old, believing she had only ever been an ordinary wife in an ordinary town. Lorraine folded the brown page along its old creases. Down the hall, she could hear Earl stirring from his afternoon sleep, the small sounds of a frail old man who had carried a stone in his chest for 50 years and never set it down. She thought she would go to him, not to forgive him the way you forgive a debt, with the ledger still open between you, but the way Sarah must have come back to Abraham's tent after Gerar, as a woman who had been defended by God, walking back toward a husband who had been spared by the same mercy. The man on the hill had been laid low. The frightened husband had been kept and called a prophet, and the woman in the middle of it had been guarded every step of a road she thought she walked alone. Maybe that is your road too, friend. Maybe you have only just found out that someone who should have protected you was quiet when they should have spoken, and the betrayal of it sits in your chest like a brittle letter you cannot unread. Take a breath here with me, if you would. Because the question that matters most is not whether the one who should have guarded you failed. People fail. Husbands fail. Fathers fail. The powerful fail you, and the trusted go silent. The question is the one Earl Mabry took 50 years to ask. Who else was in the room? Whose hand was on the door you never even knew was being pushed? When the one who should defend you steps out of the gap, the Lord does not. He withheld the harm in Gerar. He laid a fever on the hill above the Catawba. He keeps watch while the watchmen sleep, and he does not slumber, and he is a buckler to all those who trust in him, and very often the proof of it does not arrive until you are 71 years old and kneeling on a pine floor, learning at last how close you once came, and who it was that stood between you and the worst of it. The unseen hand is still a hand. The silent defense is still a defense. And the God who shut a kingdom for the sake of one faithful woman is still, this very night, standing exactly where the frightened cannot stand. Keep your eyes open, friend. He has been keeping you longer than you know. Good night, and God bless.